that it's being recorded. And in 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our panel, Elites, Violence and Institutional Racism in Latin America. I would like first to thank my panelists. These are outstanding researchers that have been very generous with their time. And I think you will really enjoy listening to all the information that they will share with us about their work and findings. This afternoon, you are going to hear a variety of different perspectives on the impact of the United States on reinforcing white supremacies, paramilitarism, and structural racism in Latin America, as well as how these countries, particularly Mexico and Colombia, are currently working on deconstructing racist stereotypes and trying to develop more inclusive strategies in their domestic policies. We also are going to learn more about the impact of the American public health policy on the Latino immigrant community. So I am going to introduce our panelists, and after their presentations, we are going to have some minutes for questions and answers. All right, so let me start by introducing a very special guest, Dean Jennifer Holmes. Dr. Holmes is the Dean of the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Science at the University of Texas at Dallas. In addition to numerous journal articles, she is the author of 7 books, including Guns, Drugs, and Development in Colombia, and Terrorism and Democratic Stability Revisited. Her areas of research are political violence, terrorism, and political development with an emphasis on Latin America, especially in Colombia and Peru. Also in our panel, we have Dr. Agustin Palao-Medizabal. Dr. Palao-Medizabal is a clinical assistant professor in the new college at the University of North Texas at Frisco. He received his PhD in public policy and political economy from the University of Texas at Dallas, and his master in financial analysis from Universidad Carlos III in Madrid, Spain. He worked as a research specialist at the Mexican Central Bank. His research interests are focused on political and economic factors for development in either local areas or country level, with a special interest in developing communities in Latin America. And also with us this afternoon, Dr. Marcela Nava. Dr. Marcela Nava is a health equity researcher. She studied the political economy of health and public policy to look for what works in reducing health inequalities and protecting community health. She's a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar and an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Arlington. Her current research focuses on the intersection of political, economic, and social contexts of immigrants and other marginalized groups in the United States. So after this brief introduction, let's start with Dean Jennifer Holmes and her presentation, Colombia, a Violent Legacy of Exclusion.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cayenes. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. Just so you know, I'm actually on vacation today, but I am happy to be here with all of you. It's always great to be able to support brilliant former students like Dr. Cayenes, and hopefully I will get there sometime in the future to see you all in person. Well, what I thought would be good, given your topic today, is talk about kind of the price of exclusion. Colombia in general has one of the longest, still continuing to some extent, one of the longest running insurgencies in the Western Hemisphere. And by great part, really fueled by a history of exclusion. So I'm just going to introduce that topic today. We'll be running through Colombian history in 15 minutes, but it has many good lessons for all of us. So tip of South America, right south of Panama. Panama, incidentally, actually used to be part of what is now Colombia, but that's a different story. But it's a beautiful country with 2 different coasts, many types of topography. with that being said, actually what's quite interesting about that geography is that it has created a landscape that is ripe for insurgency. There are plenty of places for people to hide and attack the government or other banditry, that sort of thing. And also it's made it very difficult for any government to really consolidate control. Okay, so, and because of that, we have what's been called endemic and permanent warfare, lots of persistent regionalism since the colonial period of independence. And many of what we call now departments, or what US students might think of as states, have tried to secede and become independent many times throughout history. So it's a very, very interesting place. It's a beautiful country, but it's very hard for that central government to have control. Now, I think for our purposes today, we're going to start at La Violencia, nastiest civil wars that the hemisphere has experienced. And it started in a transfer of power in 1946 between the two main parties, the liberals and conservatives. This conflict emerged and it was fratricidal in the rural areas. But it was a 10-year conflict between those two main political parties. And during this period, it really degenerated this conflict into a spiral of conflict that wiped out what little state presence existed in wide parts of the countries. So it exacerbated that historical challenge that the government had in providing any sort of order, state services, and preventing other violent groups from emerging. Of course, they might view themselves as self-defense or other. Everyone views them as themselves as a self-defense force. But let's think of this 48. So there was a king who was kind of the more reformist wing of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party was the dominant party, had most support, but that liberal wing was very conflicted. He was definitely more progressive and was the favorite of the masses in the urban cities and the poor, the urban poor in particular. So he was basically a big challenge to the existing order. And so he was assassinated actually in 1948. And as you can see here in the picture, you can see how popular he was. This was a picture taken right before his assassination. And afterwards, there was a simultaneous eruption riot in protest of his assassination. And actually, if you have been to Bogota, you will see much of the old city is no longer there. It was destroyed. It was burned down and leveled. So there's a very small part of Bogota that has survived, but the city was just absolutely destroyed in this mob. It was a 10-hour riot that left much of downtown just leveled. So there was lots of rioting after murder that basically intensified between the liberals and conservatives. It really was a spark that just led to a civil war that cost hundreds of thousands of Colombians their lives. So I think for our purpose is after that, the conservatives got to power. And in fact, the liberals didn't even run a candidate because there was so much repression in this time period. And so the response to this early rebellion after the assassination of a very popular reformist candidate was just more violence. Okay, so the conservative government cracked down, suspended civil liberties. There was a lot of repression against the liberal opposition, who the conservatives just said they're all communists. Now, to be sure, there were some communists in the Liberal Party, but the whole Liberal Party was not communist, and there was need for legitimate reform. But of course, all reform attempts were branded as communist, and then that was used as an excuse to crack down further. So we had years and years of brutal authoritarian regime of the Conservative Party, and then there was a coup. Okay, so we had a military regime take over. And of course, what did they do? They repressed everyone. So we had ruling by decree, we had secret police that stirred up violence against schools, lots of embezzlement of government money to buy land for himself. And eventually this dictator, this military junta, the leader had to go into exile. So there's some pictures here. These are actually famous paintings of the violence in the time period. And you can imagine, I mean, fratricidal conflict, very nasty, lots of deaths. So then basically what happened is the liberal and the conservative parties came together to end the conflict. And that sounds great. It definitely ended the Civil War. But as a Colombian has described this agreement called the National Front, the two traditional decided to steal together. So that's a very cynical description of it. But the two main parties got together, settled their differences. Of course, the downside was they excluded anyone else from participating, okay? So, and there was also a permanent state of siege here in that period of time. So this was a very rigid power sharing agreement that kind of perpetuated this traditional exclusivity of the Colombian state and the main parties. And in fact, you had until 1972, basically a power sharing agreement where they had negotiated who would get so many seats, who would be president, and it would just alternate. So people weren't voting. I mean, they would vote, but it didn't really determine anything. It determined internal candidacy members, but it did not influence who was in power. And there was also no local elections at this time. Local elections didn't happen in Colombia, like for mayor, until after a constitutional reform in the 90s. So this was a very exclusive power sharing agreement that froze out anyone who wasn't part of the main two political parties. And of course, as you can imagine, you had the formation politically, so they had no choice really but to compete in violence in the peripheral areas of state control in Colombia. And as we mentioned, given the geography, there are a lot of areas that we would call peripheral areas where it's very hard to control. So I'm just going to talk about the major leftist group, just since we're so short on time. So I'm going to talk about the Farc. So the Farc basically has deep historical groups in the early agrarian conflict. That's another theme that's very consistent in Colombia. And in Latin America in general, there's lots of history of extreme land concentration and ownership by a few people. And it's just a highly unequal legacy really from independence in the colonial times. So of course, when the conquistadors came and they basically claimed huge swaths of land and then passed that on through their families. So most of the valuable land was held by a few very, very fortunate people. And even when you had independence, it basically left that historic inequity in place. So the Farc started with peasants who started fighting during these land conflicts. And these land conflict is one theme that does not go away and is still alive and well today in Colombia. So they had origins here against these large landed estates. Now the Farc have continued to evolve. They actually really started evolving in La Violencia, where they were self-defense peasant groups that were fighting in the Civil War. But after that Civil War ended and during the National Front, when they couldn't participate politically, they kept mobilizing. Okay, so this group basically came through with demands for land reform, but added charges of corruptions. They were very anti-capitalist and they were very much against US imperialism and its motivations. And I'm sure Dr. Cayenes and others have told you of some of the checkered past of US intervention in Latin America, which is called US imperialism. So this is one of the things that the Farc, among other groups, were fighting against. So if we lots of conflict, lots of demobilization and peace talks that mostly are unsuccessful. I will say in the 80s, early 90s, there was a demobilization of some FARC fighters into a leftist political party called the UP, Unión Patriótica. But what happened is they were basically assassinated by paramilitary groups with, some people say, I think history's on their side, largely complicity of the Colombian military and armed forces. I once heard a negotiator in this early peace agreement said, well, and I asked him, what about all the assassinations of UP fighters who demobilized and became part of this political party? And he told me quite coldly, they're just guerrillas. That's why they were assassinated. So you can see from the FARC perspective, why would you participate in good faith in any sort of negotiations? Nonetheless, President Pastrana in the late 90s decided to try again. I mean, endemic civil war and rebellion does need to get settled at some point. So they tried again. And in return, what the President Pastrana did is he basically gave a Switzerland-sized chunk of Colombia to the FARC, where they could stay and be safe from government attacks while there were peace processes. Now, unfortunately, it's also thought with fairly good evidence to back this up that the FARC weren't interested in peace either. And they were basically building their capability and funding structure through a lot of narco trafficking and their involvement in coca growing regions, but they weren't very serious either. Anyway, on February 19th, 2002, the FARC took a Colombian member of Congress hostage. And in response, the Colombian military said, enough, we're going to retake this area. And those peace talks failed. Now, this is the beginning of President Pastrana's and the US coming together with a big aid package called Plan Colombia. And it looks like a good plan. It's been very controversial. There's a lot written on this, but the plan itself looks good. It talks about alternative development to give people alternatives in coca growing and get that resource away from rebels. It's also talking about strengthening political and judicial institutions, which everyone agrees, and increasing military capability. Now, I will say on the left, you can see a sign that says the gringos provide the arms and the Colombian provides the deaths, right? So there is some controversy over that. There's always been discussion of how do you professionalize the armed forces to break ties with other illicit groups on the right, paramilitaries, which we're not going to talk about today, but that has been a struggle of Colombia to build their military capacity, but do it in a way that is professional and that respects human rights. That's definitely a tension and one of the main areas of controversy about Plan Colombia. So after Pastrana, Uribe became president, and Alvaro Uribe is a very hard line, definitely was not in doing any with the FARC to defeat them militarily. So he had a different plan that also talked about consolidating state control, eliminating drug traffic and cultivation. Whether or not they were super serious about that is something we can talk later. The maintenance of state strength and improvement in efficacy and transparency. Now, Uribe is also a very controversial figure. You did have lots of stability return. So homicide rates fell in half in his presidency from 67 down to the low 30s. And acts of terrorism from the FARC and other leftist groups also fell significantly by about 75%. So Uribe absolutely pounded the FARC relentlessly. But there were problems with the military and accusations of human rights violations, a big scandal called falsos positivos, which is false positives, where civilians were murdered and passed off as guerrilla fighters. So some nasty incentives, to build, because you had commanders who were rewarded for the number of FARC killed. So lots of problems as that Colombian state continued to grow and become more powerful. So then what we get at the end of the conflict, give a little coda to that. But the next President Santos really did try to finally, for once and all, end that conflict with the Farc. So there were peace processes, peace talks in Cuba. They did become successful. And around 2016, we had a referendum, which actually failed, it just barely failed. It went to Congress, and we do have peace talks. So some of the main issues they're supposed to deal with in Colombia: land reform, again, a couple hundred years into this conversation; political participation after demobilization, another ongoing theme; disarmament, the end of trafficking and illicit economies, the rights of the victims, and peace deal implementation. We're about 6 years on, and we have many ongoing issues. We still have forced displacement of armed actors. So there's a lot of, especially, I know you're talking about racism, there are indigenous people in Colombia, there are Afro-Colombians, and they unfortunately do receive too much attention to these armed groups. And there's been a lot of very tragic attacks on them and their traditions and their traditional lands. We have continued land grabbing of those communities and others. We have remobilized paramilitaries, other violent groups. Maybe they're just thuggish, maybe they have more political motivation, but that again is up for discussion. And the question is there a real peace? The ELN, which is a different group, which is still very active, especially in the East, but we have these ongoing conflicts. As I end here, because I think I'm just at the end of my time, Colombia does have a traditionally the small conflicts, but the big ones continue. So I guess the question for us today is, as violence does continue to reemerge in Colombia, we're not at the bad days of the 90s, but there's still quite a few areas it can be quite violent, especially if you're a human rights activist or activist against land grabbing. Anyway, I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, I am mute here. You can hear me here. Thank you, Dean Holmes. It has been an enlightening presentation. Today we have, could you hear me there well? Yeah. So today we have learned more about the role of history and geography on determining social violence, guerrillas, and political strategies in Colombia. So we will, I am sure there are more questions here. We will see that at the end of the presentation, but now I will turn to Dr. Palao-Medizabal, who is going to share with us the experience of Mexico in dealing with race and political power.
All right. Thank you, Professor Callanes. Let me start sharing my screen so I can chat about this part. Yes, I would like to talk about perspectives of race and racism, specifically in Mexico, because I think I have some sort of credentials as Professor Callanes introduced myself. I was raised and born in Mexico City. So besides my professional experience and career, in a personal sense, I have a general feeling, a general sense of what racism means for Mexicans and how do we perceive diversity and inclusion, right? So for the starters, I would say that such perspectives are completely different from the US perspective. Although both countries had slavery and in Mexico, they did an emancipation proclamation way before the US in the 1820s, 1810 to 1820 in the process of independence from Spain. But still, the perception of segregation, equal rights, freedom is kind of different, I would say is completely different. So I would like to try to explain that. So here's my general outline. I would like to ask this question: is there racism in Mexico? Some historical background, why we can understand what kind of racism do we have there. Some myths of the mixed race that I'm going to explain later on, and the Mexico's racial divide, right? So that is my general outline. So is there racism in Mexico? Well, of course they are, but surprisingly, that was not considered as an issue until the 1990s, when the government started to recognize that Mexico is a multicultural country, and that is in the 1990s, amending the Article 4 of the Mexican Constitution. They started to recognize that, right? So, just to let you know, having around 65 different indigenous ethnic groups, plus the European heritage and all the immigrants from all parts of the world, it is difficult to think that the Mexican society doesn't have negative attitudes or views on race and ethnicity, right? So we have that cultural background that we can say that we have some sort of racism in Mexico. So the lack of this acknowledgement probably started as a political need when in Mexico's independence from Spain, and later on in the Mexican Revolution, when the government decided to adopt this concept of mestizaje, right? To forge this unified identity that the country needed after the colonial period, and after the struggle of different groups in the Mexican Revolution. So they come up with this concept of mestizaje. And actually, I just happily found in a Doctor's Nava webpage, I saw that she is identifying herself as a mestiza, right? So, and that is like some example of what this concept means for all of us in I would say in the whole Latin America, right? So that is the a big concept with some pros and some cons about this approach of mestizaje. So just a brief historical background. In the as you may know, colonialism in Mexico from Spain, in terms of race and racism, that gave that different perspective compared to the U.S., right? So with the colonial period, there is this big pyramid of classes, of castes, social castes or castas, that started at the very top with the Spanish-born in Europe, called the Peninsulars, then the Creoles or Creoles, Spanish-born in the Americas, or were the groups that ruled the institutions in the colonial Americas, right? So, and below them we have different racially mixed groups, and they put different labels to all these groups that comes from this mixture in races. For example, we have Black and Spanish called mulattoes, or Indian and Spanish mestizos. All these kind of labels were not only because of the race, but also because of the social strata that we have in the colonial period. So it was a mixture between race and social stratification, economic stratification. So that is like a very interesting mixture that the Spanish created in the colonial reigns in Latin America. So that is just an example, and they have more than these labels that I'm just presenting. This is just a few of them, but there are a lot of labels that they have between these mixtures between racial groups. And so, so after the continue with this historical background and the myths of mixed race. After Mexico's independence, people start to think about that and what is my identity, right? What is my my background? Are we Indios or Europeans, right? Because sometimes we have families created from these different groups, as we saw on the previous slide, and we didn't have this identity, with this clear identity, right? So that's where writers and intellectuals started to think about this concept of mestizo as the answer. To create this identity, this only identity unique for, in the case of Mexicans, that creates them as a singular race, like this writer, researcher, and politician, Jose Vasconcelos. He said that Mexicans belong to our raza cósmica, or a cosmic race, right? That share the best characteristic of all ethnic groups. So, and that happened exactly after the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920s, having this concept were important, politically important, to create this cohesion of the identity of Mexicans there. So that is the base, or one of the motivations for having this a concept of mestizaje or mestizos, which is mixed race, right? But as you can see here, we have different population composition with different groups. 62% are considered as mestizos, then 7% Amerindian, and 10% other. And this is only an estimation because, just for you to know, Mexico does not collect census data on ethnicity, right? There are just studies or independent studies that try to collect this population composition based on race. Right, so once we have this myth created, or well, this myth, no, this concept of mestizaje, there's still some racial divide in an everyday conversation on or racism in a daily life. If you happen to travel to Mexico, any part of Mexico, and you will hear some terms like these ones that I'm presenting, referring to different people like Indio or Negro or Prieto, right? Those are kind of negative connotations, but we can make like a small tweak on there, right? We always have a way to smooth or the discourse of these labels. So if you want to blunt the insult or the negative connotation, you can use diminutives on those labels, like prietito, for example. It's like saying, okay, poor guy, he doesn't know, or he or she cannot be blamed or being on that skin color because comes from her parents. So it's a small one. It's a prietito, right? So something like that. And on the other side, we have on this racial divide, we have the other connotations, right? Like the one that is positive, or if we want to refer to someone that is superior or have at least some sort of influence, even economic or social power on that regard. So we can call them güeros, right? It's the whites. They are the whites, fair-skinned, and that means that if you've been called as güero, that express approval and acknowledge that superiority, right? Sometimes if you go to a street market in any Mexican city, and you can hear that seller selling you something and refer to you as güero. So I am a güero, and other people that are probably dark can be a güero there because they want to make some business with you, right? So the Mexican people try to use that sort of connotations to express, to make you feel better, or to make you feel like you are superior, and you want that attention that that you are looking for, right? So that is some kind of everyday conversations in Mexico's life, and people people don't acknowledge that kind of connotations or messages that they are sending, especially for previous generations. Probably this generation, new generations, are taking into account more this kind of expressions or words, but words or racism is well beyond words, right? So as we can see here, the National Institution of Statistics and Geography in Mexico, they found in a survey, in a pretty recent survey, that 24% of indigenous people had experienced discrimination, and a higher percentage, a 75% percentage, felt undervalued, right? So there's still more than words, more than mentioning or labeling people, groups of people that that comes from this racial divide. Is still some discrimination behind that labeling in the different classes or races that we have in Mexico. So to that end, some argue that this is not a matter of races, but classes. But this is kind of overlapping, right? These are two concepts that even governments or Mexican society haven't solved yet. That what is classism versus racism? So it is a combination of both, because economic positions, social positions are well intertwined with your skin color, but still it doesn't mean that it is not racism or it's only classes. So they clearly overlap, right? So I will finish here just a very brief overview of what is the perspective in Mexico about the race and racism. We have this heritage, this colonial heritage, and this different ethnic groups that makes us so diverse that sometimes the identity that we are trying to find is constantly clashing with the social part, the economic part, with the color of your skin or your origins, your ethnic origins, right? So is still in Mexico, is still a big social challenge, and government and society need to acknowledge and to recognize that this is creating in a big sense, in a big part, that level of inequalities that we have in our society, right? So those kind of social divide and racial divide is creating that level of severity in economic inequality or welfare inequality, and given access and accessibility of different welfare areas based on groups or social classes or the color of your skin. So yeah, I will stop here.
Thank you for this great presentation about Mexico, which is not only a strong influencer in Latin America, but also an important country for the United States. We are going to discuss more. I'm sure there are questions there on this topic. Now I will turn to my colleague, Marcela, Dr. Marcela Nava, who is going to share with us her research on the impact of the American public health policy on the Latino immigrant community.
Hi, well, thank you. And hello to Dr. Holmes and Dr. Palao-Medizabal and Dr. Cayenes. Thank you for having me today. Dr. Holmes actually will be familiar with some of what I'm presenting. She had the fortune or misfortune to oversee part of my doctoral research. So let me just share my screen here. Let's hope that it comes out the way I want it to. So are you able to see? Did that go in? All right, so you've got my main screen, right? Not the notes. Okay, good. All right, so what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus on talking about how I can't spell policy on a title slide, public health policy and Latino and Hispanic immigrants. So I'm going to build a bit on, sorry, give me a second. I just noticed my screen is doing a live transcription and I'm not sure what that is. Let me just turn that off because that seems a bit distracting. So let me start just by, I'm going to treat it a little bit as a story and try to stitch together some different pieces of what I've heard the other panelists talk about, and some research that some of my colleagues have done and some research that I've done. But I want to start and take it into a completely a direction that my research focuses on, which is really the intersection of policy and health and how that impacts immigrants, particularly Latin American immigrants in the United States. And so just to introduce you to kind of the basic idea of health, and this is a lot of the times when in public health and population health research, there's a really important focus on understanding how groups vary in terms of different types of statistics, and cancer, a very, very expensive and a very costly area of intervention, is obviously a very important area for folks to understand. So there's a lot of interest in studying rates and comparing groups based on who has access to cancer prevention, say type of screenings. If we're talking about cervical cancer, which is some of the research that colleagues that I'll share with you today, then a lot of research will look at rates of people that are receiving pap smears, people that have received HPV vaccines, the number of people that will actually be diagnosed with cervical cancer, the number of people that will die from cervical cancer, the number of people that may have complications. So it's very important to compare the challenge, the significant challenge when it comes to understanding how public policy impacts Latinx immigrants in the United States, is that we simply don't know in a lot of cases, because our statistics on and how we compare groups are based on the racial constructs that were developed in the United States. And like you just heard Dr. Agustin, talk about the concepts of race that exist in the United States don't align necessarily with those of immigrants in the United States. But at the same time, our concepts of race in the United States, when it comes to immigrants, are very loosely and strangely tied to immigration status and lawful immigration status, which creates a very confusing scenario. So just to kind of give you an example of some of the little bits and pieces of research that really we draw on. This is from research done by a colleague of mine, where they looked at, now I'm located in North Texas, which is a state that has chosen not to expand Medicaid. It's a state that has one of the largest immigrant populations, and we're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is one of the largest and growing destination sites for immigrants, particularly again Latinx and Mexican immigrants in the United States. So when we compare two different counties that are side by side, and we compare them in terms of the rates of Hispanic women or people with cervixes, Hispanic women that are diagnosed with cervical cancer, and those that die from cervical cancer, what we see that there are two counties side by side, where Tarrant County and Dallas County, there is a similar rate of incidence. So women are getting diagnosed with cervical cancer at about the same rate in these two counties. But in one county, they're dying, they have 1.4 times higher likelihood of dying. So they're significantly higher risk of dying, even though they're getting diagnosed at about the same rate. And that's a really important consideration, because I'll be honest, I don't know much about cervical cancer and the health dynamics, but I'm very interested. And these are the types of statistics that help point that where we have to dig and understand, are there public policies at play here that define what happens to somebody after a diagnosis that will impact their likelihood to survive and to get treatment? And cervical cancer is just, again, it's a convenient area for a lot of people to look at, because cervical cancer is so incredibly and easily preventable. It is very preventable in terms of vaccines. It is very preventable if caught early, and it has a very slow progression. So disparities in cervical cancer really point not necessarily to bio kind of genetic factors, but they are really strong indicators that there is something very, very wrong in terms of people being able to access very basic prevention and healthcare screenings compared to other groups. So yeah, it's very difficult to understand. This study was not able, and again, research, we don't collect statistics on immigration status. We don't collect statistics on nationality. And so the best that we can do sometimes is go into communities and ask questions and try to disentangle what aspects of immigration and immigration policy may be a factor here. And so I'm sharing this research because this is research that I've been hoping would emerge in some context for because a lot of what emerged from this study and from folks that were interviewed as part of the study was some of what we suspected in this area, which was that a lack of access to care and can make a big difference. And when it comes to public policy and health policy, these differences can vary dramatically from space to space. So I'm going to share little bits and pieces of research that I've done and kind of try to shape the story a little bit here. But I want to point out this idea that I'll come back to here at the end, which is this idea of the political economy of migration. Because when we talk in public health and in population health, we talk a lot about the social determinants of health. And so basically we talk a lot about, we spend a lot of time trying to educate health professionals, physicians, other healthcare providers to look beyond the individual and their health. And what seems like a normal, rational thing for those of us that are in more of the policy, political science space is a very difficult thing for physicians and healthcare providers to wrap their mind around. But part of what is missing, significantly missing, is the political economy of migration. Because when we look at the health of immigrants, we're not just looking at national policies, we're not just looking at racism, we're looking at a very complex system that goes from the global sense all the way down to the individual sense, and we're not good at understanding that. And so, for example, this is just from an interview and some research that I did. One participant that is an entrepreneur here in Dallas County was reminding us of these folks that are increasingly coming from Central America, especially from Honduras, from Guatemala, El Salvador. A lot of them have been working in large factories known as maquiladoras. And so these are owned by very large US-based clothing companies. And so some of the clothes that we all may be wearing right now were probably made thanks to the benefit of low-income labor in Central America. Now, when we think about this geographically, however, the reality is that a lot of the folks that are coming to the United States are coming from years and years and years of working for a US-based or US derivative type of company, a factory that has not invested in their education, that has not invested in their skills. So when they come to the United States, you have actually a very convenient labor force to folks to plug into some of the US-based companies and US-based factories. And so there's a global context where even though folks may shift their geography, they may be essentially working for the same large corporations, stuck in the same type of low wage labor with little opportunity for advancement and subject to a lot of the same type of structural and legal limitations. So it's important to remember that these types of health factors are shaped oftentimes before immigrants even come to the United States by the very same companies, global corporations in some cases, that they come to work for. So this isn't a national system. The other thing that really is difficult for many folks to think about when they're studying immigration is that when we look at just the policy of immigration, it's very, very easy to overlook the politics of immigration. And as much as we acknowledge that there is a lot of politics, those of us that are here in Texas know that this is an everyday reality, the politics of immigration, the politics of just about everything. But what we often will say something like, well, I just can't imagine how difficult it must be for somebody to, and then the story stops there. But the reality is folks are still living, folks are still thriving. And we have many, many people in different educational systems trying to navigate folks through things like education and healthcare, but the very politics of it is structurally built in. And so this again is just a quote from a person who was a gatekeeper, who worked at a local community college, whose job was to help folks enroll, and who received very explicit guidance from their leadership saying, we don't want to be seen as a sanctuary campus, which on its surface doesn't say anything about immigration. It says nothing about race, but it's a very clear message that says we don't want to get involved in the politics of this, even though we are an institution that is supposed to be available and accessible to all. So the economic, geographic forces, the labor forces, and the political systems really create a very different and difficult to understand framework. And within all of that, that is still taking place in the US context, where people may be coming to the United States on the premise of the American dream. But something that has increasingly become true is that the American dream, which again, I think most folks know at this point to be a myth, the reality is that for a lot of folks, running into essentially the barriers of the limitations that they have, having to accept the challenges that sometimes are difficult to understand the reasons for. That in and of itself can be a very, very traumatizing and challenging things that a lot of folks experience when they come to the country. So I want to kind of frame that. I'll kind of give you kind of some layers to add into that, but I want to frame that idea that when it comes to understanding how public policy impacts immigration and impacts the health of Latinx immigrants, we don't know, and there's a lot of different pieces to try to disentangle. So one of the pieces we try to disentangle is looking at just the overwhelming array of policies that shift the healthcare access of immigrants in very, very different ways than it does that of everybody else. And so while immigrants in Texas, for example, may be largely from, at least undocumented immigrants, may be largely from Latin America, there are laws that have been passed at federal levels, at state levels, and at local levels that control and create barriers where in many cases, people who are immigrants and are not lawful permanent residents are explicitly prohibited from accessing programs. So undocumented Mexican immigrants in DFW, for example, are explicitly prohibited from receiving Medicaid through any type of federal funds. The state of Texas, in turn, has a choice to extend Medicaid, and it has chosen not to. And so what Texas does is it actually delegates the responsibility for caring for the uninsured to the counties. And so within the state of Texas, due to not necessarily a statute, but due to legal interpretations of what is a resident, the situation now in Texas, and this has been the case for almost 20 years now, is that local publicly funded hospital districts, meaning a hospital district that receives property taxes to provide healthcare for people who are uninsured, which and they're considered a safety net hospital, a hospital of last resort. They have the choice in Texas to prohibit providing taxpayer funded, and when I keep saying taxpayer funded because it's important to think about who is paying taxes, who is paying property taxes. So people that are paying property taxes but are not considered residents under federal law in the state of Texas are able to, or the hospital districts are able to essentially prohibit them from accessing healthcare. And that is just so incredibly important to realize that the very definition of what is a resident is in many cases what gets taken advantage of here, because a lawful permanent resident at a federal level is a designation that creates certain types of legal and political protections. But at a state level and at a county level, deciding who's a state or county resident is really all about who has to pay taxes and who do we have to care for. And so in this case, because of the ambiguity in the law, people who are undocumented in the state of Texas could essentially be considered non-residents for both state and federal purposes. So what does this mean? What does it mean when there's a public hospital district that does not recognize undocumented immigrants as residents and therefore chooses to not provide financial assistance? Well, that means that you have stories like this, like somebody that has kidney failure and has dialysis, and so they don't qualify for Medicaid, they don't qualify for healthcare from the local hospital. So there may be, and there are many situations of somebody who needs dialysis, who needs regular, intensive, expensive, painful, lengthy, chronic, constant blood transfusions that cannot schedule an appointment to do this, right? Because again, they would not be able to cover the cost of that, which means that the only practical option left for many people, and there are stories and stories and stories of social workers who work in the emergency room that work with folks here, essentially have to wait until they meet the criteria of what is an emergency to then go into the ER to receive emergency to dialysis on an emergency basis and then return home. So if you think about this, again, what this person I think really described this almost playing chicken with death, this kind of tempting, how bad do I need to get before I get the help of last resort because I don't qualify for the help that's supposed to prevent it. This is what's happening right now in Tarrant County. Also, folks that are, again, regularly told you may be hemorrhaging, maybe you need to have a hysterectomy, come back when it's a little bit worse. And so what you see now is the impact that this now has even on contiguous geographic zones, because when you have two side-by-side counties with very different policies, one of which is very restrictive, and then the one next to it, Dallas, which is much more inclusive, you've got many folks that will now go to the healthcare system in the neighboring county, where they basically will need to qualify as a county resident, which could be as easy as getting borrowing an address, or in many cases just moving there. So you see that even where you live geographically in terms of your political county subdivision can shape in many cases, and seems to be shaping the likelihood of you dying from very preventable and easy other conditions to treat. Now, see, I know I don't want to go too far on time. So just to kind of show you and connect this into the context of race and that really strange overlap between race and immigration. This is part of some research that I did where I was trying to look at how do different groups vary based on immigration or race in terms of health. And so there is a very widely used metric of self-rated health. It doesn't look very scientific, but it actually is in most, at least in research in the United States, it is actually fairly consistent and does a good job of reporting somebody's actual health status. We don't know how well this holds for the health of immigrants. So we don't know in many cases what the actual health of immigrants is. There are many different ways of measuring health. So is self-rated health the best way to capture it, or is it how many physically unhealthy days or how many mentally unhealthy days? So there are big differences in what we think about health, because we may have folks that are reporting extremely high levels of physical health. And this may be the case for many immigrants, especially that are in different types of manual labor that require a level of physical resilience, but there may be significantly high numbers of mentally unhealthy days. And so what we consider health, we don't really have a good framework. But when you compare some very basic things, like even just the term Hispanic, which there is probably the poorest, most misunderstood term in terms of racial ethnicity, but Hispanic, as we've talked about, is a very, very poor measure of race, especially or ethnicity, if we're talking about health. Because when you compare just not if you take two groups of folks, and this has been held up in other research, but if you were to look at folks who describe themselves as Hispanic, but then you also ask them, do other people label you as Hispanic as well? So in other words, is there a consistency that you see yourself as Hispanic and other folks may see you as Hispanic, or potentially do they see you as white or something else? When you look at that and you just differentiate people who all see themselves Hispanic just based on what they're ascribed, I guess, races, you see significant differences in levels of health. So what we see there is, again, that how people identify you can make a significant difference in your health. And depending on your expectations, that could be for better or it could be for worse. When you look at when you look at immigration status, sometimes we talk about immigration status and we tend to assume citizen and non-citizen. But there is such an array of different types of legal statuses. And when we look at health status varies at different points along the way, whether somebody was born a US citizen or became naturalized, whether they've been a lawful permanent resident for more than 5 years, which shapes their access to very basic types of health care. Even skin color. One of the most interesting things here was asking folks to point to pictures and describe themselves in terms of a lot of what we see in this kind of more Spanish colonial, mulatto, mestizo, criollo type kind of framework. And what we see there is that there is very, very, very little impact of skin color when it comes to looking at immigrants and people from immigrant families, in most categories of health, the only space where it really seems to make a difference is in activity limitations. So even skin color and the role of skin color seems to have a different role than being ascribed Hispanic, which has a different role than your lawful status. So all of that to say that when we're talking about public policy and immigration, there is a growing understanding that we can't talk about the social determinants of health. We're increasingly pushed now to think about the political determinants of health. And this is an essential framework to really understand how to really bring in the basic understanding of things that we just take for granted and we don't think about, like the fact that people with DACA could have graduate degrees, could have doctorates, but not be eligible for a federally backed mortgage, which we saw with redlining, made a significant impact on African-American communities historically. We see that there are barriers to income and revenue. We may have folks that come from very entrepreneurial backgrounds, and when trying to shift that to the US economy, face a lot of regulatory barriers. Even the lack of education. Talking about immigration and immigration policy is not a standard part of most legal training. It is not a standard part of most social work or health provider training, and so on and so on. So I'm happy to expand on a lot of these, but I just want to wrap up with just, again, emphasizing how little we actually know, but how important it is and how many clues we have that there is a lot of concerns that we have missed in terms of how the health of immigrants, but also a lot of missed opportunities in terms of promoting their health. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Nava. It has been an enlightening presentation today. We have learned more about the role of institutions on determining access to health for the Latino community. Now I would like to take these last minutes to go over questions that you might have. If you have a question that you would like to pose to one or all the panelists, you will see the questions and answer box down at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to put your questions there. Also, if you are at Social Hall, the microphones will be open for you to share your questions or comments. So I have a question here that one student shared with me for Dr. Holmes. This question said that while the land concentration persists in Colombia, what do you think is going to be the future for the peace agreement, especially in the current context now? And they are changing, they are going over elections. So this is going to depend on the current administration, the administration in turn, or this peace agreement can be sustainable for the future of Colombia?
That's a really great question. The current president is not a huge supporter of the peace agreement. He's not particularly enthusiastic about it, so that's definitely a risk. I'm reminded of one of my longtime collaborators who's not on this call, but she says, the real future is if you can get Colombians beyond being dependent on land and help them see opportunity in other areas. It's kind of a way to sidestep some of those intractable policy questions that, Colombia just hasn't been able to really deal with. But I would say, absolutely, the peace process is in peril. It's in peril because continued land grabs, problems with implementation, failure to protect people. I mean, you've actually had more assassination of activists, whether or not they're highlighting these issues of land or indigenous activists. So that's, until people are protected, I think we're just not going to see a fully successful implementation.
Yeah, I think Colombians have a lot of work now in the future, especially with these elections coming up. They recently held elections this last Sunday, and it's coming the second round in the next month. So we will see how it is going to develop.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and now this question is for Agustin, for Dr. Palao-Medizabal. So what policies do you think the Mexican government should implement or are implementing now? My students know that the current administration is more progressive. And so are they developing more inclusive policies currently that you are aware, or do you would like to comment?
Yes, in fact, for this administration is like a big political pursuit on giving rights to indigenous groups, indigenous people. I don't know if you have seen, right when this current president took office, they celebrate with indigenous groups wearing all their costumes and hats and all that kind of things from these indigenous groups. So yes, there is some policies about that. Actually, we have this National Institute, Indigenous Institute, that promotes and creates policies to protect the indigenous groups in Mexico. But as you know, it's from that point to the implementation and to see some sort of impacts or benefits, it's a long trip. So they are still developing that or working on that, and sometimes get lost on that political discourse. Sometimes it's a real policy, it's a real thing. So yes, that's the current situation now. They are working on that, but they need to protect the real impact of those policies.
Thank you so much for that clarification there in the topic. So this is a question for Dr. Nava. Dr. Nava, your research allowed you to see if the Afro-Latino population was being affected differently from the Latino, let's say, mestizo population. Did your data allow you to do that distinction, or you observed the distinction when you were doing your fieldwork?
That's a great question. I did have, so in my research, I was able to include people that identified as immigrants or children of immigrants. And we had a pretty great representation of folks from different, or whose families originated in different parts of the world. In terms of having, I didn't have enough to be able to compare people that who originated, or whose home country or whose family originated from say Afro Latino countries or skin color, but I think that there is an implicit connection there in terms of skin color and that self-ascribed identity. I think that as little as we understand about immigrants from kind of more of a Hispanic Latinx framework, we understand even less about Afro-Latino immigrants. So I think that is a really, so I would say that I certainly don't, I don't have enough data to make speculations about it, but I do know that it is part of the bigger picture here of unraveling the different impacts of skin color, self-ascribed identity, and then even looking at the different context of what does it mean to be Afro-Latino in one's home country versus what does it mean to be Afro-Latino there? Because like I said, like Agustin was talking about, being Afro-Latino may carry a very, very, very different context in Mexico and Dominican Republic than it would in the US. And in some cases that can be for better or for worse, again, depending on what geographic part of the country you end up in. I certainly don't know that Texas would be as welcoming to Afro-Latinos as other parts of the country, for example. So I think there's a lot to explore there.
Absolutely. And we have just 1 minute here, and I would like to just leave this question open for anyone of you that would like to comment. This question was made by one of my students in last semester to me. And I remember very clear this question. It asks if we think that mestizaje help or hurt the indigenous population. The process of mestizaje. What do you think? In the case, yes, I was
very quickly. I think it's twofold. It's twofold because mestizaje gives great values, great identity, a sense of identity, but that by doing that you are covering racial issues at the same time, right? So you are thinking that everybody is mestizo or everybody is in the same place, while it is not. So so that's the twofold thing that before we go, I just got a question from the audience about the concept of colorism. Colorism is some discrimination among the same racial group, right? But it's still racism. Exactly. So and that is happening in this even in the US, here in the US, or back in Mexico. In social media, probably you have heard that term, whitexicans, like combination of white and Mexican. All these kind of things are trying to make differences among the population. And I feel that, yeah, we need to work a lot as a global society.
Thank you so much again. We have learned a lot this afternoon, and you all have been very generous with your time. I cannot be more grateful to all of you. Thank you for your time, and thank you all of you for sharing this afternoon with us. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.